Hello, everybody. This is Todd Dewey from Ice Road Truckers on the History Channel, and I love to listen to TNC Radio.live.
I'm Shelley Johnson with Kathy Tuccaro. You can hear us Tuesdays on TNCRadio.live at 8 p.m. Eastern on Women Road Warriors. And don't miss Steve Summers' Overnight Drive right here on TNCRadio.live, weeknights midnight to 5 a.m. Eastern. Brought to you by Hot Shot Secret.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the train station on TNCRadio.live. Thanks so much for tuning in. I am Bill Waldrop, your host, along with my co-host, Jim Leaders. And our guest this week is Doyle McCormack. He is out. Doyle, you're out of Portland, Oregon now. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's great. Well, we appreciate you being here so much, sir. And, a lot of the rail fans know of your history. It's a long history in railroading, but as usual with our guest, we'd like to start out with your young life. Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in Geneva, Ohio, in June 18th, 1943. Okay. And my dad was working for the nickel plate up there at that point. And my whole life I was spent around the Conneaut area, my growing up years. So that's where I got started.
So I guess that kind of goes to my next question is, how did you get into railroading? Did you just have a natural interest as a child? And of course, the next question is, or did you have family members in it? But you said that your dad was in it. Anybody else in your family involved in railroading that influenced you?
Oh yeah, a lot of my ancestors were railroaders. My dad was born and raised in West Virginia. He was born in 1903. His dad, my grandfather, worked for a little railroad called the Winifred Railroad, which was a coal mining operation. And my dad went to a one-room schoolhouse up Winifred Holler. And then a few years later, my grandfather quit the Winifred and went to work for the C&O. And my dad got a job at the C&O when he was 15 years old, checking cars in Hanley Yard. He got the job because he could read and write. In West Virginia in those days, that was a high skill.
Wow.
And he started that career there and stayed with the C&O until the Depression. And as the Depression was easing up, he got a call from one of his fellow railroaders down there that had migrated north, called my dad and said, hey, they're looking for operators up here on the nickel plate, and it's a pretty good outfit to work for. So my dad packed up and moved up to Ohio, and I went to work on the nickel plate there about 1939.
So it was pretty much automatic that you were going to be in railroading.
Oh, yeah. I got inoculated early, and it's a disease you catch, and once you catch it, you can't get rid of it. So.
Yes, sir. We're all guilty of that.
So, my dad was a train dispatcher, and I was 10 years old, and he used to have to make these qualifying trips over the division on a train twice a year just to familiarize himself with the situations out there. And when I was 10, he took me with him on one of those trips. And he worked a sort of a relief job. So it was on a Saturday on second trick. And we had a westbound hotshot freight train called the Flying Saucer. And he would work till 4 o'clock, and then he'd come home and get something to eat and go out and get on the Saucer and go west. And he'd get into Bellevue in time to get on that meat train that come out at night called CB12 and be back home by midnight, 1 o'clock, so he can get his rest to go to work the next day. And on that day, in September 11th, would have been 1953, he took me with him on a nickel plate Berkshire on the hottest train on the railroad, and we did 132 miles in 2 hours and 40 minutes.
Wow.
That's moving.
That's where I got infected with this disease of railroading. I made my mind up right there. All I ever wanted to do was be a locomotive engineer.
And you certainly did, which we're going to hear all about. Now, you hired out with the nickel plate in 1965. Let's see, you graduated high school in 61 and went into the military, and you served 4 years there.
Yep.
and then you hired out. You got out of the military on August 23rd of 65 and hired out with the railroad August 30th. What
Right.
took you so long? Wow.
Well, you know, you got to remember the Nickel Plate Railroad was almost like a family-run railroad.
Right.
And everybody knew everybody else, and my dad was pretty well liked. And the road foreman engines there was a gentleman named John Fox, and I actually rode another Berkshire trip with him and my dad, and I had talked to him about I wanted to get a job firing. Well, when I got out of school, we were in sort of a recession. That's when I went to the Navy just to get out in the world. And as soon as I come home, I went to talk to John Fox, and he said, "Well, I need to hire some guys, but I don't have the authority to hire them yet." So I took a job there as a clerk and then an operator. And then in February of '66, John Fox called me on the phone. I was working at GC Tower in Vermilion. And he said, "You still want the job firing?" I said, "You bet." He said, "Well, you're number one." He said, "When you get done there today," he said, "go to Cleveland, mark up on the fireman's extra board." So the next day I was a fireman in Cleveland Yard.
Just like that.
Just that easy.
Wow. But your first job with Nickel Plate, you were a telegraph operator.
Well, I took a job initially as a clerk in Bellevue Yard, but they had a strange arrangement with what they call a seniority extra board, which meant you only got to work 1 day a week. Right. And I ran out of money, and I went home and was down in the office with my dad, and the chief dispatcher come in, Ray Reed. And he saw me and he said, "Hey, you're out of the Navy, you looking for a job?" I said, "Yeah." I says, "Can you put me to work?" And he said, "Yeah." And my dad told him I was working down at Bellevue. He went out the door and he come back about 10 minutes later. He says, "Tomorrow," he says, "you go to work at CD down in Cleveland Yard as an operator."
Just like that.
Just like that.
The good old days. Wow. Impressive.
And that was still in the days of train orders and telegraph, right?
Well, there was no telegraph. The telegraph system was still intact, but by then everybody had gone to telephones and teletype machines. All of that apparatus was still in place. And there were still a lot of the old operators out there that would sometimes get on there and talk to each other so nobody else could hear what they were saying.
Right.
Doyle, real quick, did any of your siblings in your family also get into railroading, or were you the only one?
Oh, no. The whole family got into railroading.
Wow.
Like I said, my grandfather was a conductor on the C&O, and I had a couple of great uncles that were on the C&O. And then my dad worked for the Nickel Plate, the C&O and the Nickel Plate. And my mother worked for the Nickel Plate during World War II as a report clerk.
Wow.
Both my brothers worked on the Nickel Plate. Later, my older brother went to work in engine service. He got cut off during the steam era, and when it was over, and became a telegrapher and became a dispatcher, as chief dispatcher. My younger brother got a job firing, and he didn't like that because of the irregular hours, and then got a job in the signal department with regular hours. But he wandered away from the railroad after a few years.
Yeah.
So I was the only one in my family that did not work for the Nickel Plate.
Wow.
But you worked for a railroad, no doubt. But okay.
I worked for the N&W, which at that point was still the Nickel Plate.
Right.
It was being run by the Nickel Plate people, and it was a couple of years before they really made any dramatic changes in the way the railroad operated.
Gotcha. Now tell me about the Nickel Plate 759. You were a volunteer on the rebuild of that engine. Tell us about the engine.
Well, I lived there in Conneaut, and my brother was working the chief dispatcher's job, assistant chief. And he called me one day and said, "Hey, they brought one of those Berkshires to town. It's down the roundhouse. They're going to rebuild it." So I went wandering down there, and there was a big sign on the door that said "No trespassing," but the window was open, and I was standing there looking in the window. And this guy come by and started talking to him. And I says, "You looking for volunteers?" He said, "Yeah, come on in. We're looking for all we can get." So I volunteered there, and that was Ross Rowland's adventure. And that was in the spring of 68.
Right.
And got heavily involved with working on the 759 and made several trips with that. We did the Golden Spike Centennial Limited.
Tell us about that trip. Where did it start and end? And tell us a little about that trip.
Now, that started in New York. And that, again, I got to give Ross Rowland a lot of credit. He put that whole package together and managed to get everybody lined up and the train put together and painted. in about 10 months. And we left New York City and went all the way to Kansas City. And there we had to get on the UP. And of course, the UP are a little bit concerned about foreign steam on their railroad, but we went by diesel to Ogden.
And still to this day, they feel that way.
Yeah. And so we were there for the big celebration at Promontory Point. And then we made our way back to New York after the trip was over. It was about, I don't know, I want to say almost a month on the road with it.
Now, what did you do on that train? Were you the engineer on it, or what all?
I was just a snot-nosed kid in those days. I was a grease monkey and gopher, whatever you want to call it. But
right,
I got to say, my time there, I had the privilege of working with some of the brightest people that I've ever been around, and they knew what they were doing with that steam engine, and I helped them. And as time went on, I just stayed with it. And then after the Golden Spike trip, the next thing that came up was a Freedom Train.
Right.
And that was one of those adventures that was on again, off again, on again, off again. And finally, in November of 1974, I got a call. We're going to Portland to do the daylight. You want to go? And I said, well, sure, I'll go. And so I joined the Freedom Train organization right there.
I'll tell you, we'll talk about that in the next segment.
Okay.
But in 1970, you promoted on the railroad up to engineer.
I was.
So what kind of engines did you run, and where did you run?
I ran between Conneaut and Bellevue, and I ran anything they put out there.
All right.
I ran Fairbanks Morris. I think we had a couple of Morphodite Baldwins and Jeeps. A lot of it was, in the beginning, was all nickel plate power, and then the NW started sending up some of their stuff, the SD40s, SD45s.
Right.
And,
so this is all diesel era running.
Oh, yeah. 65, steam was all gone by then.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good. Well, I'll tell you, let's take a break here real quick, and we'll pick up on the next one about the American Freedom Train, how you got involved in that, and how long you traveled with them across the country. I'm Bill Waldrop, along with Jim Leaders, your co-host, and you are in the train station. Our guest this week is Doyle McCormack. We appreciate him being here. We'll continue our interview with him in just a moment. Stay tuned.
It's Landline Now, followed by Steve Summers' Overnight Drive every night on TNCRadio.live starting at 11 p.m. Eastern and 10 p.m. Central.
I'm Dr. Christopher Cortman, and now for the Mental Health Minute. Let's talk about anxiety. Did you know that anxiety is now considered to be the common cold of all mental illness? Yeah, as a matter of fact, 18% of our population is deemed to have an anxiety disorder. And I think the other 82% are lying about it. But is anxiety a mental illness? Is it a disorder? I mean, isn't it normal to be anxious? How do you know when you have an anxiety disorder versus normal anxiety? Well, there are 3 ways we can measure that: frequency, intensity, and duration of your anxiety. In other words, how often are you anxious? How much of the day do you spend nervous, worried, edgy? And how intense is your anxiety? I mean, does it interfere with your life? Do you have panic attacks? Does it stop you from dealing with other people and situations? And then the duration. How long does it last when you are anxious? If you find that any of those 3 or all 3 of those things are significant, it might be time to get some professional help. But where does anxiety come from? Not from situations, not from other people or circumstances in your life. Anxiety comes from the perception of threat. In fact, investment plus perceived threat is the formula for anxiety. In other words, you have to care about something, and you have to perceive that that something is threatened in order to create anxiety. So if you are anxious, what do we do with that? Let me give you 4 things that will work right away if you're dealing with anxiety. First, daily exercise. The research says if you exercise daily, you will decrease your anxiety. Secondly, learn to breathe properly. Even in short-term anxiety-inducing situations, inhaling to the count of 3 and exhaling to the count of 5 will reduce your anxiety significantly. Thirdly, take that formula that I gave you and figure out, am I too invested in something that doesn't really mean that much? Can I see this in a less threatening manner? Because if I can think differently, it will also reduce my anxiety. And finally, and this begins with young people all the way to the end of life, face the things that you're afraid of. By facing the things that scare you and championing those things, you will reduce your anxiety and become a more confident person.
Be sure to listen to Building Strong Minds with Dr. Chris, Mondays at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, right here on tncradio.live.
Welcome back to the train station on tncradio.live. I'm Bill Waldrop along with Jim Leaders, my co-host. Hey, if you have any questions or comments or ideas for our show, we would love to hear from you. Jot down this email address and drop us a line. Our email address is houstonrailfans@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. Our guest this week is Doyle McCormack, and we heard about his early life and getting introduced into the world of railroading as a child and growing up and working for the N&W, Nickel Plate. So, Doyle, we want to start here now about the American Freedom Train. Last segment, we talked about the Golden Spike. Now we're going to kind of go into the American Freedom Train project, which started around November of 1974. How did you get involved with it, and what were your expectations going into it?
Well, I got involved because I was involved with Ross Rowland, in the early days with the 759 and the Golden Spike trip. And when it came time to get people to go on this Freedom Train adventure, he called people that were known to him. And I got that call and said, hey, we're going to Portland to rebuild the daylight. You want to go? And like I say, I threw my hat in the ring. 2 weeks later, I was on an airplane headed for Portland. Got out there and out here, I guess, and moved the engine out of Oaks Park, which was parked down here in downtown Portland, up to the BN Roundhouse in Portland, and started a rebuild on it.
What was the history of the 4449? We've all seen it. It's a beautiful engine. Did it look like that in the park? And can you kind of give us a brief history of that engine up to the time it was going to be rebuilt? Well,
it was part of SP's motive power fleet, and it's a Lima engine, which to me says it's a Cadillac. They had done some extensive mechanical work on it prior to its retirement, and they donated to the city of Portland, and it was down at Oaks Park there. We got it out of the park, and the interesting thing is we moved that engine in one day over 4 different railroads.
Wow.
Yeah, that interchanged with 3 other railroads. It's on the Portland Traction Company. We went to the SP, then we went to Portland Terminal, then we went to BN. We put it in the roundhouse there at Portland, and 126 days we had her fired up.
Golly. So they must have taken pretty good care of it before they stuffed and mounted it, where it was, a little quicker to get back into service, I guess.
Well, in my later research, I found out that was the third to the last engine to get rebuilt in SP's Taylor Yard shops in LA before they shut the whole thing down. Okay. And it had very few miles on it. That's one of the things that saved us, because it wasn't completely wore out. And we did, boiler work, tubes and flues and all that. And the running gear was in remarkably good condition. And that's what saved us. So we took it out on the road and ran her for over 2 years. And we had our share of problems with it, like any machine, but we kept her going.
Now, you were an engineer on that train, is that correct?
I was.
So you had already had some steam operation experience as an engineer, or was it just kind of put your feet to the fire and learned it as you went? What was your experience before the 4449 in
Well,
steam?
I had quite a bit of experience with the 759 firing it, and I ran it a couple of times.
Oh, okay.
But I was sort of naive on oil burners and, running an engine. And I'd had a lot of experience running trains with my job on the NW. And I got to say that the men I worked for on the old nickel plate were probably some of the best locomotive engineers in the whole country.
Yeah.
And I learned from them, those people. And what I learned from them has carried me through my whole career as an engineer. So it was kind of funny because I didn't really know that much about how to run this engine. And we were deadheading it to back to Chicago to pick up the train, and we were making down the SP. We went down the SP to Sacramento and then across to Ogden and then UP. But going down the SP, there were still a lot of steam guys on the SP that had run those engines, and a couple of them, I learned from. But one road foreman in particular, named Larry DeBose, and he got on the engine. He was a tall, handsome gentleman in a three-piece gray suit and didn't have much to say. He just said, "Mind if I run the engine?" I said, "No, that'd be great." He sat down in that seat, and I mean, that engine just took off like it was shot out of a slingshot.
He knew what he was doing.
Oh, man, I mean to tell you. And I watched him, and the next morning, I was keeping track of the fuel and water consumption, and we were doing on an average of, 10 gallons of fuel and 100 gallons of water per mile, because I was trying to get a feel for what we were faced with in the future. And when I did the calculations on that evening in Klamath Falls, he had cut the fuel and water consumption in half.
Wow.
So the next morning I walked down the depot platform. Of course, I'm a 32-year-old kid at that point. Walked up to him and I said, "Mr. DeBose," I said, "you know something about that engine that I don't. You're going to teach me what it is." And he roared with a big belly laugh and he said, "Kid," he said, "I've been running engines around here since I was 16 years old." So he told me how to run that engine. And he kept saying, "You got to listen to it, kid. You got to listen to it. She'll tell you what she wants." Well, all I heard was noise. But he described to me how to interpret that sound. And it took me several months before I could see the very subtle differences by moving the reverser just one notch would change the sound of the exhaust. And I learned all I needed to know about a steam engine from Larry. I'll tell you that.
One thing I learned from Steve Lee, one of his sayings was, you engineer by the seat of your pants.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, an engineer's got all his brains in the seat of his pants.
That could go for a lot of things.
Yeah, but even today, when I worked as a locomotive engineer for 38 years, and right up to the day you retired, every train was different.
Yeah.
And you had to get the feel of it and be able to interpret what was going on in order to do a good job.
Now, the American Freedom Train went all over the country. Y'all hit every state. Is that correct?
Yeah, the Freedom Train did. We missed part of it because of the size of the engine up in the northeastern states. There were some clearances up there we couldn't get through.
Right.
We did everything from Chicago west and basically from Washington, D.C. south.
Except for Texas, where the 610 ran that, right?
Only a little portion of it. That was another adventure.
Now, were you involved in running that engine, or did y'all take a break with the 4449 when the 610 was running?
Oh, no, I was the engineer for the Freedom Train.
Oh, so you, whatever engine was on there, you ran it.
I ran the T1 and I ran the 610. Now, Ross did a lot of the running on the T1, but he had a job he had to go back to on occasion. And when he had to go back to work, I'd come out and run the T1 for him.
And I guess many stories about, the train, that could probably go on for hours. Now, all the states, all the people, the artifacts, the interesting personalities you met, maybe some famous people, that there must be a lot of stories there.
Oh, there are. I could go on for weeks. It was better than a 4-year college education, I can tell you that.
Oh, I bet. And so you ran this engine all over the country over was it a 2-year span, 75 through 76?
Yeah. The Freedom Train was 19 months. Started in 75, went into 76, and ended in Miami, Florida. And then we deadheaded the engine all the way back to Portland. Kept it in service out here since then. We've run a lot of excursion trains out of here.
Do you have any idea how many miles you traveled in that engine on the Freedom Train years?
About probably 25,000 miles.
Golly. That's a lot of fuel and water.
Yeah, it was.
Well, after the Freedom Train, y'all returned 4449 to Portland in June of 77. That's when you said you deadheaded it from Miami to Portland?
Well, it's called the Deadhead. We ran the Freedom Train Foundation from Washington got a hold of Amtrak, and we ran an Amtrak excursion train all the way from Miami to Portland. There was 2 segments. The first one was right after the first of the year in 77. We ran from Miami to escapes me. We came part way, tied up the engine, and then we went back later that spring and ran all the way to Portland.
Interesting. All right. Now after that, in June of 77, returned her to Portland and all that. And then you went back to Ohio, went back to work for the N&W, right? Just
I did.
Yeah, just back to work.
We put it in the UP Freight House down here, blew her out, and went back home, called up, marked up in the pool out of Conneaut, working out of there. Well, there's an old saying says you can never go home. You can't keep them down on the farm after they've seen Perry.
Right.
The 2 years that I was gone, there were a lot of changes on the railroad, and some of them weren't good changes. And both me and my wife, our horizons had expanded. And after about a year, we looked at each other and said, what the hell are we doing here? So I started calling around out here in Portland, looked for a job, and the SP was hiring. So I come out here and got a job on the SP and engine service. And that's where I finished my engineering career, was working between Eugene and Portland here in Oregon.
And you're still there today.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's a beautiful country up there. Absolutely. Let's take another break, guys, and we'll come back for the next segment. Our guest this week is Doyle McCormack. He was the engineer on the American Freedom Train all over the United States and continues to work in the railroading field. It's a long history. We have a lot more to talk about. I'm Bill Waldrop, along with Jim Leaders, my co-host, and you are in the train station on tncradio.live. Thank you for joining us. We'll be right back.
Hey, rideshare drivers and gig economy workers, the host of tncradio.live, the Rideshare Rodeo podcast, and the Gig Economy podcast come together for news, talk, music, stories, laughs, and more. We're live Fridays at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, right here on tncradio.live.
At Hotshot Secret, we share the science behind common diesel problems. For example,
diesel fuel cetane levels.
The cetane rating in diesel fuel is 42 to 45. Most diesel engines operate more efficiently with a cetane rating of 48 to 50. One treatment of Hotshot Secret Diesel Extreme will raise your cetane 7 points, increase fuel economy, and improve cold starts.
Hotshot Secret Diesel Extreme is available nationwide at truck stops, fine farm and auto stores, and online at hotshotsecret.com. Hotshot Secret, powered by science.
Front Lane introduces Impulse, the world's first collision alert system for the driver behind you when you have to brake hard. Impulse uses ultra-bright pulsing red LEDs to alert drivers behind you who might not be giving their full attention to the road. Using amazing accelerometer technology and a battery that will last for years, Impulse installs in minutes, fits nearly any vehicle, and never requires additional wiring. Drivers react 50% faster, helping to protect you and your passengers. Learn more by visiting www.frontlane.com/impulse. That's www.frontlane.com/impulse. Approved by all 50 states. Impulse by Front Lane.
tncradio.live, your commercial driver navigation station.
Welcome back to the train station. You are tuned into tncradio.live. Thank you so much for tuning in. Along with my co-host Jim Leaders, I am Bill Waldrop, your host, and our guest this week is Doyle McCormack. He is in Portland, Oregon, and as you heard in the first couple of segments, a long railroad career, including running by steam all over the United States in the 70s with the American Freedom Train. Doyle, thanks again for joining us. Now, we're back when you and your wife moved to Portland, Oregon, and went to work for the Southern Pacific. Was that a whole different experience with a whole different railroad, or was it kind of the same thing as the other railroads? Are they all about the same, or what were the differences?
Well, the SP was a good railroad to work for. I enjoyed the years I worked for the SP there because I saw the same thing on the SP that I had seen on the nickel plate when I was back east. The guys knew their job and knew how to do it, and you didn't have a lot of pressure. You went to work, you did your job, and they left you alone. And that was like that till the UP took over. And of course, there was another transition there to the UP. That was the second merger, basically, I went through.
Gotcha. Now, in 1980, y'all revived 4449 again. So it was out of service for a couple of years. And you put it back in service and started running steam excursions with that engine. Now, did it have to be rebuilt again, or just kind of knock the dust off and she was ready to go? What all did you have to do to get her revived again in 1980?
Well, it was kind of interesting because we had gone to the SP several times about running excursions out of here, and her answer was always not only no, but hell no.
Right.
And then the opening of the California State Railroad Museum was coming up there in 81, and they found out late in the game that the UP was going to bring their 2 steam engines out there to the museum, and the SP had been put a lot of time, effort, and money into building the museum, and they were going to get overshadowed by the UP, so they came to us in a panic there in February of 81 and said, can you get the 49 ready to go to Sacramento? So we pulled her out of the barn where she was at, buffed her down, put a new paint job on it, and off to Sacramento we went. Well, the miles and the years that we did on the Freedom Train and the years of storage were not kind to that engine.
Right.
So it's a long story, but we had a guy come to us and offer to pay to have it rebuilt. And we went to the SP again, and by then we had a new president named Rob Krebs, and I don't know whether you know that name or not.
Oh yeah.
He is a true gentleman, let me tell you. So he had a sales meeting here, and our contact here, George Krause, got us an interview with him. And we went down and told him we had this grand scheme. We wanted to run this trip from Portland, Oregon to New Orleans, Louisiana for the 1984 World's Fair. Krebs was listening to our spiel, and I was really shocked because after it was over, he looked at it from a strictly business perspective. He says, how much is this going to cost us? I said, well, sir, it's not going to cost you anything. As a matter of fact, we're going to pay you to go over there. And he says, well, what's in it for me? I said, well, you're going to be on the front page of every newspaper from every town you go through from Portland, Oregon to New Orleans, Louisiana in a good light instead of for some derailment somewhere. And he says, I like that. We'll do it. And so we put 10 months into completely rebuilding the engine again. And we did the New Orleans trip, and she's been in service ever since.
Was that engine always in that beautiful daylight paint scheme, or was it black originally, or what's the history of that paint scheme on that thing?
Well, the paint scheme, it came painted into red and orange. It was built in 1941, and that was when the daylight was in its heyday.
Right.
And then in its later years, of course, after the war and everything, and diesels were coming in, they just sort of relegated it down to freight service and extra service. So it was all black when we got it. It's kind of funny when we pulled it out of the park over there, and we were standing there looking at it. They had repainted it, and they had Southern Pacific on the tank, but they had misspelled Southern.
Oh no!
Yeah, SOUTHFRN. They forgot to put a bottom leg on the E.
Oh no!
Doyle, did you say that Mr. Krebs immediately after you had told him all the publicity he was going to get, he approved it right there on the spot?
Right there on the spot.
It's good to be the king.
He looked at it from a strictly business perspective, which is what a railroad executive needs to do. And
right.
Because they get a lot of grief. The railroads always get a lot of grief from the press.
Oh, yeah.
And here was a chance. We painted the whole train, and we had a beautiful looking train, and we got him a lot of front page coverage.
Our NRHS chapter here in Houston sponsored part of that from San Antonio, Houston to New Orleans and up to Dallas, I believe.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. And we had a lot of customers. Everybody was very excited to see that engine here in Houston.
And luckily, Union Pacific also picked up on the fact of what a great PR machine it is, because they're still running today all over their trackage. And I mean, it's very positive press. Amazing. I mean, news media were putting up helicopters and chasing this thing and talking about the history of it. And, that's, I guess you could call it free advertising, although it costs a lot to run the trains. But they figured it out a long time ago and continued to do so. So hats off to them.
Yeah, when they run those steam engines, UP, it's a PR tool for them because they get out on the main line. They go to towns where they're there, not in an emergency situation. They're there to show off the railroad, and people come down to see the steam engine, and they get to tell the railroad story.
They do. And I had the honor of working with Steve Lee and the UP Steam program for 23 years myself. I didn't really work engine service. They'd let me, dope the locomotive and, put in the water and things like that. But mostly I was in the back doing souvenirs and PR. And it was a real honor to be able to work with Steve and that amazing crew and travel all over the country with them. Lots of great memories, so many good stories. As we all know, once you see a steam engine the first time, you never forget it. And, you got it for life. So it was a real honor.
Yeah, they're infectious.
Yes, they are. Now, real quick, we've got about 6 minutes left here, Doyle. You continued restoring some vintage railroad equipment, including an Alco PA1 project. Tell me how, who started that, how that got started, and what all was involved with it, and what did you do with it once you got it restored?
Well, that again goes back to my nickel plate heritage. My dad took me on another train ride on a passenger train there, and we rode in the cab of the original nickel plate 190. And of course, everything was steam then, but the beautiful blue and white engine to a 12-year-old was something to covet. And I always had this burning desire to own one day, and I never lost that desire. And it'd take a whole hour to talk about the journey from Mexico to here and where I'm at with it.
It came out of Mexico.
Oh yeah, it was original Santa Fe unit, bought by the D&H, and when they got done with it, it ended up in Mexico, and the Mexicans pretty well trashed it. But they had 4 of them, and they were the last 4 in existence in the country. And I followed them the whole time they were down there, and I worked with Bill Withune at the Smithsonian. He was after one, and I was after one, and we finally joined forces, and we managed to pull it off and get 2 of them back. But there wasn't much left of them. They come up on flat cars, and you could look in the nose door and see all the way out the back.
Oh, no.
I remember seeing pictures of that. It was pretty.
All that came up was no section in the frame.
Yeah.
God.
I managed to
no prime mover, nothing.
Nothing.
God.
It's been a real challenge to get the thing done. MK had rebuilt it, and they had a Alco 251 engine. I thought, that'll be a piece of cake. So I ended up buying a wrecked MLW M420B unit, which had all the component parts. That became my organ donor. And I transplanted the whole innards of that unit into the PA. The trucks were a big hurdle because they had disappeared down in Mexico. I was got a call from Mike Del Vecchio, and he said, "Hey, there's a guy up in Canada says he knows where there's some trucks that might work under there." So I called him, and he said, "Yeah, there's 3 Fairbanks Morris B units in a rail welding plant that they're scrapping up here." And he says the trucks are almost identical to the PA trucks.
Wow.
So I got those out of Canada. Another funny story, because I called up about them, and this guy was in Montreal and got his phone number, and I called him up, and his name was Ken Annable. And I introduced myself and said, "I'm interested in those trucks on those B units you're cutting up in Smiths Falls." He says, "Oh, another player in the game, eh?" And I said, "Well, I didn't know we were playing a game, but count me in." So he was talking about everybody was calling him, wanting them to donate here and donate there. And I says, "Well, I want to buy him." He says, "Oh, you got money?" And I said, "Yeah." So we negotiated a price and loaded them in 2 gondolas and shipped them off to Oregon.
Wow. How lucky was that? And they were ready to be torched, huh?
Yeah. They were cutting up the B units. And when I was talking to this guy, I went up there to load them. All was sitting there with the trucks from under the units, sitting on the ground, loaded them in 2 guns, and away they went.
Timing is everything.
Yeah.
So your project is a foundation now for this PA1?
Oh, no. That's mine, lock, stock, and barrel.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll get to that in the next segment. But real quick, before we go to that next segment, you retired from the SP in May of 2003.
Yep.
Okay. And you've been retired ever since.
Yeah, luckily, yes. Well, I don't know what I call it, retired. I just changed jobs.
Yeah. Well, there you go. That's a good way to look at it. More on that in the next segment. You are in the train station. Our guest this week is Doyle McCormack. We appreciate him being here. I'm Bill Waldrop along with Jim Leaders. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Join Shelley Johnson and Kathy Tuccaro every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Central Time for Women Road Warriors on your driver navigation station, tncradio.live.
We got love that we'll never need to hide. Love will always rise above whatever comes.
Don't miss Marcia Campbell, North America's trucking sweetheart, Thursdays at 6 p.m. on tncradio.live.
Welcome back to the train station on tncradio.live. I'm Bill Waldrop along with Jim Leaders, my co-host. Our guest this week is the fascinating Doyle McCormack out of Portland, Oregon. And we mentioned in the last segment that you officially retired from railroading from the SP in May of 2003. And then you started getting into the Oregon Rail Heritage Foundation. Tell me about that, what it's all about. And it says here, working on a new permanent home for City of Portland steam locomotives, as in there's more than one. Tell us the story.
The park where we got the 49 out of, there were 3 engines down there. There was actually 4. There was another one that was a Finnish engine, but that's another long story. But there were 3 locomotives down there that were germane to Portland, and that was the SP 4449 and the SP&S 700, another 484, and a UP engine, which was a Pacific. And they were in the park. They were going to build a museum down there in the 50s, which never come to fruition. So when we moved up to Brooklyn Roundhouse there in 81, we were in that roundhouse for 30 years. And the other 2 engines migrated up there a little later in the years. But when the UP took over the SP, the handwriting was on the walls that the roundhouse was not going to survive much longer. And we had to find a new home for it. So we set about building our own facility. And again, that was another great adventure for a illiterate person like myself, only going to the 12th grade, but managed to raise money and build this beautiful building. It's 120 feet wide, 240 feet long, and it is well lit. And that's the permanent home for the collection of Portland steam engines. So we're right down on the riverfront there by Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. It's a beautiful place. If you ever get out here, come visit it.
Oh, we will.
Absolutely. I've been to Portland, but honestly, I didn't know about that. But it gives me a good reason to come back just to come see those engines.
Fly in. You can get to us by light rail or streetcar.
Yeah, y'all have a great light rail system in Portland.
Yep. Goes right by our front door.
We're jealous because we have one in Houston, but I call it the light rail to nowhere. It doesn't go anywhere anybody wants to go. It doesn't go to any of the airports or anything important. It just kind of goes to ghetto neighborhoods. It's lovely. So a couple of things for you, Doyle. Obviously, you've traveled around the country and worked all over the country. Have you ever traveled to other countries to ride trains or photograph them, anything like that, or not? What's your history on your fascination of railroads away from like the 4449, things like that?
Well, yeah, I have been other places. I went to China back in about 1986. There was a tour put together to go to the factory there at Datong and watch them build steam locomotives. And boy, that was a fascinating trip. 2 weeks after I had retired, I'm getting ahead of myself, but they ran that Hudson across Canada. And I was instrumental in getting the boiler rebuilt for that down here. So they had me come up there, and I made another transcontinental trip on the CP Hudson all the way to, we did 2 of them, one to Montreal and one to Toronto. So I've been up there and run that engine. And I've been pretty heavily involved in a lot of other restorations. I've bought and sold some equipment, some locomotives, some passenger cars, and rebuilt a few others. And rebuilt the Sumter Valley 282. I worked more after I retired than I did when I was working.
Isn't that always the case?
Yeah.
So you went to China. Did you ever? I know a lot of people traveled to Cuba and watched steam railroading down there. Did you ever make it to Cuba?
No, I had no real desire to go to Cuba.
I went there about 3 years ago. It was fascinating. We'll tell you about that off the air. That was interesting. Yeah. I'm glad I went, but have no reason to ever go back. So one quick thing. You said the engines are in the, that museum there in Portland. Is 4449 still doing any steam operations at all, or is that kind of over with now?
Well, it's not over. We designed that building around making sure it had the capacity to keep those engines running. And they're rebuilding the 700 now, and there's another opportunity to rebuild the other engine. We've got a short line here that we're on. It's about 4 miles long, and we can run out there. But we were running Amtrak excursions for over the years many, many times. And of course, that whole, with the positive train control and all that, that's sort of slowed that down. But we keep her ready to fire up in moment's notice. We run our Holiday Express with it every year.
Oh, okay.
We keep her alive.
Tell us, what's the Holiday Express? Tell us about that.
That's our moneymaker for the year. We run on this little 4-mile branch line. We have 5 cars, and we run out of the other end of the line down there at Oaks Park, and we run 4 weekends, usually before Christmas, with these holiday trains. We hauled 20,000 people this year.
Wow! Really?
Pulled by what?
By the 4449. What do you think?
Oh, wow! Oh, okay. I mean, it literally is ready to roll out of there and fire up.
Yeah, it's sitting down there. It'd take us a day and a half to get her hot, but we're ready to go at a moment's notice.
That's impressive. Wow, that's amazing. How awesome!
Yeah,
that'd be fun. Again, that'd be fun to go to Portland just to see that and ride it. That would be amazing.
Well, it's the 4 weekends between Christmas and Thanksgiving.
Yeah,
we run 10 trains a day, basically.
Jim, we have a trip in our future.
Yes, I think we do.
I can fly to Portland in about 3 hours. I'll do that. All right. Well, Doyle, anything you'd like to say here as we close out the show?
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you, lads.
Well, absolutely. Thank you, sir, very much for being with us. You came highly recommended, and we are not disappointed. You are an amazing man with an amazing history and just great stories. So thanks again, Doyle, for being with us. This is the Train Station on tncradio.live. He is Jim Leaders. I am Bill Waldrop. If you'd like to contact us about any questions, comments, or suggestions for our show, please write us. We are at HoustonRailFans@gmail.com. Again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week right here on the Train Station. Have a great day.